They thought I was a senile old woman, just waiting for the cold embrace of the grave. But they didn't know that for 5 years, I was meticulously planning the moment I would take everything back from them, including the very roof over their heads.
My name is Eleanor, and this is not a sad story about an old woman forgotten in a nursing home. This is the story of how I used my family's greed against them to engineer a downfall so complete they never saw it coming. It all started on my 70th birthday with a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. You see, I adored my son, Mark, and his wife, Sarah. After my husband, Arthur, passed away, they were my entire world. I owned a beautiful, sprawling Victorian estate that had been in our family for 4 generations. It was filled with memories, antiques, and love. But as my arthritis worsened, they became concerned. They suggested I sign the deed over to them to protect the asset from future medical bills. They promised I would live out my days in the home I loved. I trusted them. I signed. Within 6 months, the mask slipped. I was moved from the master bedroom to the small, cold guest room above the garage. Sarah started referring to my antique furniture as clutter. But the breaking point came the night of my 70th birthday. I was walking past their cracked living room door. They thought I was asleep. I heard Sarah say, "We need to sell this place. It's a gold mine. We can put Eleanor in that new care facility in the valley. It's affordable, and she won't know the difference anyway." My son didn't object. He just sighed and said, "I know, but we have to wait for the right moment. The market is peaking." The world went silent. My heart didn't break. It turned to steel. They thought I was just a senile grandmother. They were about to learn that I was also Arthur's wife, a man who had been the city's most ruthless forensic accountant. And he had taught me well. I didn't confront them. I didn't cry. The next morning, I smiled at breakfast, complained softly about my forgetfulness, and played my role perfectly, but the game had begun. First, I needed an ally they wouldn't suspect. I started visiting the public library under the guise of getting out of the house. I didn't read novels. I researched property law, tax fraud, and digital asset tracking. I discovered that while they owned the deed to the house, my husband and I had set up a complex web of family trusts years ago, which Mark knew nothing about. Arthur was paranoid about lawsuits, so he had created a fail-safe clause that neither of us had ever needed to use, until now. The house was the main asset, yes, but the contents of the house, the antique art collection, the rare first editions in Arthur's library, the jewelry, were technically owned by the Arthur and Eleanor Heritage Trust. When I signed the deed, I only signed the property, not the contents. Mark and Sarah, in their greed, had already started cataloguing the items to sell them before selling the house. They didn't realize they were documenting evidence of theft from a trust. My favorite part was watching them struggle with the 2008 IRS revision regarding capital gains tax on inherited property. Mark was trying to minimize his future tax bill by undervaluing the estate, unaware that his undervalued appraisals would backfire spectacularly. I subtly planted seeds. I'd mentioned, "Oh, Sarah, I think that old vase in the hallway might be a reproduction." Such a shame. I watched her face fall, knowing she'd likely sell it for pennies, not knowing it was an authentic Ming Dynasty piece worth $50,000. The real plan, however, required patience. I needed them to violate the trust agreement in a way that was undeniable and irreversible. I needed them to sell the trust's property. Over the next few years, I played the helpless fool. I'd lose my glasses, while I was actually cataloguing every single transaction they made. I hid my detailed notebooks in hollowed-out romance novels in the guest room. I was waiting for the big event. The moment they were so confident in their ownership that they would make a fatal mistake. And finally, that moment arrived. They announced they were throwing a massive charity gala at the house to raise their social profile before putting the property on the market. They planned to use the finest items in the trust as ambience. I sat in my cold room above the garage and smiled into the darkness. Everything was in place. The lioness was just waiting for the right moment to spring. To the world, I was a grandmother looking for large print crossword puzzles. In reality, I was looking for a shark. I needed a lawyer who didn't care about family ties, only about the letter of the law and the size of the retainer. I found Mr. Henderson. He was young, hungry, and specialized in asset recovery within complex trust structures. Our meetings took place in the back of a dusty community center. He was stunned when I handed him my first audit, a 50-page breakdown of Mark's business expenses that I had reconstructed from shredded documents I fished out of the trash over 6 months. Henderson confirmed what I suspected. By taking out a second mortgage on the house to save his failing logistics company, Mark hadn't just been greedy, he'd been sloppy. He had triggered a default on fiduciary duty clause hidden in the original 1994 family trust. But I didn't let Henderson file the lawsuit yet. If we struck too early, Mark could declare bankruptcy and hide the remaining assets. I wanted him to be fully invested before the floor dropped out. Now, let's talk about the Arthur's joke. Back in 2011, my husband was obsessed with the future of forensics. He bought 500 bitcoins when they were worth pennies, just to see how the blockchain worked. He kept the private keys on a rusted USB drive labeled Gardening Tips. Mark and Sarah had seen that drive 1,000 times. They'd even laughed at it, but they never plugged it in. In their eyes, anything of mine was junk. Using the library's secure terminal, I accessed the wallet. The junk was now worth over $30 million. This was my war chest. But I couldn't just transfer it to my bank account. That would alert Mark's creditors. I moved the funds through a series of cold wallets and eventually used a portion to establish a shell company in the Cayman Islands called Silver Oak Holdings. Through this entity, I began buying up Mark's company's debt. He thought a mysterious investor was saving him by providing low-interest bridge loans. He was so relieved, he signed every personal guarantee I sent his way. He didn't realize he was hand-delivering his entire future to his senile mother. I didn't just own his house anymore, I owned his soul. While I was busy being a digital ghost, Mark and Sarah were busy being socialites. They decided to host the Gala for the Arts. Sarah spent $80,000 of my money, well, money they thought was theirs, on catering and decor. She even had the audacity to ask me to stay in the garage apartment during the event. "The noise will be too much for your poor ears, Eleanor," she said with that fake, sugary smile. I just nodded and asked for an extra blanket. Inside that blanket, I was hiding a high-resolution scanner. I spent my nights scanning every piece of mail, every bank statement, and every contract Mark left in his home office. I was building a shadow ledger. I discovered Sarah was skimming. She was selling small pieces of my jewelry collection and replacing them with high-quality fakes, thinking I wouldn't notice the difference in weight or luster. She was committing felony-level insurance fraud, without even knowing I had the original appraisals locked in a digital vault. The trap was set. The bait was the gala. They were ready to celebrate their success in front of the whole city. They were standing on the edge of a cliff, and they were about to ask me to give them a push. And oh, I was more than happy to oblige. The night of the gala arrived. The house was glowing like a diamond. Valet drivers were lining up Porsches and Mercedes along the driveway. Arthur and I had paved 40 years ago. Sarah was wearing a designer dress that cost more than a year of my allowance. She was parading through the ballroom, pointing at the Ming vase and the family heirlooms, basking in the envy of her friends. Mark was at the bar, loud and confident, bragging about his new anonymous investor who had saved his firm. I was tucked away in my room above the garage, as ordered. But I wasn't sleeping. I was wearing my finest emerald silk gown, the one Arthur bought me in Paris. I sat in front of a bank of monitors. You see, I had installed my own security cameras months ago. I watched them toast to their future using my vintage crystal. At exactly 9:15 p.m., the investor decided it was time to collect. I picked up my phone and sent a single text message to Mr. Henderson. Release the hounds. The music was at its loudest when the front doors swung open. It wasn't more guests. It was 6 men in dark suits, led by Mr. Henderson and 4 uniformed officers. The silence that fell over the ballroom was the most beautiful sound I've ever heard. Sarah approached them, her face flushed with anger, demanding to know who they were. Henderson didn't blink. He raised a folder and said, "We are here to execute a writ of seizure for the contents of this estate and a temporary restraining order against Mark and Sarah Miller." Mark pushed through the crowd, laughing nervously. "This is a mistake. I own this house." "Oh, Mark, you owned the paper, but you forgot who owned the soul of the house." Henderson began reading the charges aloud, so every friend and socialite in the room could hear. Grand larceny, violation of fiduciary duty, tax evasion, and the most delicious one, insurance fraud. Sarah had sold the real Ming vase 3 weeks prior, and the one on display was a cheap knockoff. She'd tried to insure for $50,000. The police were there to bag it as evidence. That was my cue. I walked out of the garage, across the lawn, and entered the house through the servants' entrance. I made my way to the top of the grand staircase. I looked down at them from the balcony. Sarah looked up and shrieked, "Eleanor, tell them you gave us everything." I didn't yell. I didn't have to. I simply said, "I gave you my heart, Sarah. You wanted the furniture. I gave you my trust, Mark. You wanted the equity. Today, I am simply taking back what was never truly yours." I held up the original trust document from 1994. As of 8 minutes ago, the shell company, Silver Oak Holdings, which I own, has foreclosed on all of Mark's business assets due to a breach of the personal guarantee he signed. And because that debt was tied to this house, the void ab initio clause has been triggered. In plain English, the gift of the house was legally cancelled. It was as if I had never signed the deed at all. I wasn't a guest in their house. They were trespassers in mine. "Officers," I said, looking directly at my son, "please escort these people out of my home. They have 1 hour to pack their bags. No jewelry, no art, just their clothes." The next 60 minutes were the quietest and loudest of my life. Loud because of Sarah's hysterical sobbing as she was forced to put back the diamond earrings she had taken from my safe. Quiet because Mark simply stopped speaking. He looked at me once, not with love, but with the realization that he had completely underestimated the woman who had raised him. I sat in my favorite wingback chair in the library, watching them through the open door. Every bag they packed was inspected by a forensic locksmith and a police officer. They weren't allowed to take a single silver spoon. When the clock struck 11, they were standing on the driveway. No Uber, no limo, no help. only the suitcases they could carry. As they walked toward the gate, Sarah turned back and screamed that I was a monster. I didn't flinch. I just thought of the cold room above the garage and the way they talked about me like I was already dead. Many people ask me, Eleanor, why didn't you just sue them normally? Because a normal lawsuit takes years and costs a fortune. I wanted a total collapse. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Mark's company was in receivership. The bridge loans from my shell company had a cross-default clause. Since he lost the house, he defaulted on the loans. Since he defaulted on the loans, I seized his remaining inventory and his office building. And then came the IRS. My anonymous tip about the undervalued property taxes led to a full-scale audit of their last 7 years of returns. Sarah's little side business of selling my jewelry without reporting the income. That was the final nail in the coffin. They went from living in a $10 million mansion to a 2-bedroom rental in the least desirable part of the city. Mark is now working as a junior clerk for a firm that used to be his competitor. Sarah is learning that without my money, her friends from the gala don't even remember her name. People often wonder what I did with the Bitcoin fortune. I didn't buy a yacht. I didn't move to the south of France. I stayed right here, in the house Arthur and I built, but I made some changes. The master bedroom is now a legal clinic. The ballroom where they held that disgusting gala. It's now a communal space for the Eleanor and Arthur Foundation for Elder Justice. We provide free forensic accounting and legal aid for seniors whose families are trying to steal their dignity. Sometimes, on a rainy afternoon, I look at the USB drive labeled Gardening Tips, and I smile. Arthur would have loved this. He didn't leave me just money. He left me the tools to defend myself. I am 75 years old. My mind is sharp, my heart is full, and my home is finally my own again. To anyone out there who thinks they can silence the elderly, remember my story. We aren't just memories of the past. We are the architects of the future. And some of us are very, very good at math.